The heavy iron doors groan as they open, releasing the sickening stench of stale air and the sound of distant screams. The flickering torchlight casts long, twisted shadows against the damp stone walls. This is not a place of justice. It is a tomb for the living, a chamber where humanity is stripped away and the soul is shackled in the cold embrace of despair. For the women who found themselves here, this was not a mere prison, it was the beginning of an erasure. A slow descent into a realm where time stood still, and their very existence was denied. In the medieval world, a woman's first step into the darkness of a prison cell was a final moment of dignity, before it was shattered beyond recognition. A cruel, ritualistic process awaited those condemned by the accusers, whether for crimes real or imagined. The first act of debasement was always the same: the shaving of the head. It was not a hygienic measure, as some might have thought. It was an assault on their identity, an affront to the very essence of what it meant to be a woman in medieval society. Hair, long and flowing, had been a symbol of dignity, modesty, and womanhood. By stripping it away, they stripped the condemned of their personhood, reducing them to nothing more than a nameless, faceless victim of society's cruel whims. But the humiliation did not end there. Iron shackles were bound around their wrists and ankles, binding them to a fate that was sealed. In the grim dungeons of York and London, these women were often shackled in those iron leg restraints that not only bound them physically, but also reminded them of the weight of their presumed guilt. Those confined within the walls of these makeshift prisons, extensions of castles or monasteries, were not surrounded by justice. They were cast into cold, damp stone chambers, places that reeked of misery and isolation. The clang of chains, the rasp of tortured breath, the whispers of the condemned, this was their world. Their fate was not just imprisonment. It was the complete destruction of their spirit. Yet, in the early years of imprisonment, the concept of a separate facility for women was almost non-existent. They were thrown into cells alongside thieves, debtors, and murderers, forced to share space with those who had committed heinous acts. There was no sanctuary, no relief from the torment of being stripped of all that made them human. Even the writings of 15th century scholars, such as Ulrich Tenk, underscored the medieval belief that punishment was not for reform, it was for degradation, isolation, and the utter destruction of the self. Let them be confined and abased, he wrote, and for centuries. That was the very definition of justice in the eyes of the law. But the worst of these torments often happened in the shadows, where the faintest whisper of life was drowned by the deep, oppressive silence of the underground. In the darkest corners of these dungeons lay the oubliette, a horrifying chamber that was more a tomb than a prison. In these chambers, women were consigned to die slowly, quietly, and without mercy. The oubliette, the forgotten place, was a term that sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. These cells, carved directly into the cold, unforgiving stone, were often no larger than a coffin. Lowered into these hellish pits through a trapdoor, the condemned were left to suffer in total isolation. There was no light, no warmth, no food, nothing but the gnawing hunger and the deafening silence. In the absence of food, death took its slow, agonizing course. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks bled into months as the prisoners lay in their own filth, covered in lice and sores, their bodies slowly deteriorating. But it was not just their bodies that withered. The psychological torment of being forgotten, of slipping into the darkness and being consumed by it, broke the spirit long before the body succumbed. And when death finally came, it was often undisturbed, unmarked, and unremembered. The names of those women were wiped from history, their existence erased like chalk from a blackboard, their suffering only known to the cold, silent stone that had once held them captive, as if this were not enough. Many of these women, accused of moral crimes or suspected witchcraft, were subjected to a different form of punishment, one that marked them permanently, branding them as objects of scorn for all to see. Branding, a practice that had its roots in ancient Roman law, became a tool of social control in medieval Europe. In the late 13th century, English courts began to use branding as a punishment for women convicted of theft or repeat offenses. However, as the 15th century dawned, this punishment began to extend to women accused of what society deemed immoral behavior, women suspected of adultery, of promiscuity, or of living outside the prescribed moral code. Those women who were branded with the letter V were not just punished, they were marked for life. Their bodies, once a symbol of potential and purity, now bore a permanent scar, one that could not be erased. They were marked as nightwalkers, a term used for suspected prostitutes, forever imprisoned in a social prison that no physical cell could ever match. The mark was more than a punishment, it was a sentence that followed them for the rest of their lives. It turned them into pariahs, rejected by society, forever cast out from any hope of redemption. But it was not just the living who suffered under the weight of these laws. For the women accused of witchcraft, the dungeon became a chamber of torture, not as a form of punishment, but as a means of extracting confessions. In the late 15th century, the Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious manual for witch trials, was published, endorsing the use of torture to extract confessions from women suspected of witchcraft. The brutal methods were not intended to reveal truth, they were designed to force a confession. No matter how fictitious or concocted, torture devices, like the strappado, the thumbscrew, and the infamous rack, were used to extract confessions from those who were presumed guilty long before any formal trial began. Women were subjected to unimaginable pain, their bodies twisted and contorted, their flesh torn by the weight of their own suffering. The logic behind this torture was chillingly simple. If a woman confessed under pain, her soul would be saved. But in reality, the tortured confessions only served to further the witch hunts, spiraling into ever-increasing cycles of violence and fear. And so, the women of medieval Europe found themselves caught in an unrelenting system of punishment, where justice was a rare commodity and cruelty was an institutionalized norm. For them, prison was not just a place to be held, it was a place to be erased, to be forgotten, to be rendered invisible. The dungeon walls, cold and unyielding, stood as silent witnesses to the unimaginable horrors inflicted upon the women within. These were not just places of physical confinement, they were the spaces where women's identities were crushed, their existence denied, and their voices silenced. The prisoners who languished in these cells were not simply the victims of the law. They were the victims of a deeply patriarchal society that viewed them not as individuals, but as vessels for the moral and spiritual failings of the world. As the trials of witchcraft reached their fever pitch in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, more women found themselves locked away in dungeons, awaiting a trial that would never come, subjected to horrific torture to extract confessions, which were often forced under duress. The idea that a woman could be both a witch and an innocent was inconceivable. The accusers knew no bounds, and so many women disappeared into the depths of the medieval justice system, their fates sealed by superstition, ignorance, and a society that feared the power of women's agency. Torture devices such as the heretic's fork or the Iron Maiden became all too common. Women, often considered the weakest sex, were subjected to these agonizing methods, twisted and contorted in ways unimaginable, all in the name of extracting confessions. Whether innocent or guilty, they were doomed from the moment the accusation was made. For those who managed to survive the torture and the trial, the punishment did not end with a simple execution or the restoration of their freedom. They were left with permanent scars, both physical and emotional. The burning flame of the stake might take a woman's life, but the psychological damage inflicted upon those left behind, the ones who were branded, tortured, or abandoned in the shadows, was a wound that would never heal in the twisted landscape of medieval justice. Women were not just confined, they were obliterated, not just physically, but psychologically. Their lives were marked by a permanent social stigma that could never be erased. As centuries passed, the stories of these women faded into obscurity, their names lost to time, their suffering forgotten by history. Yet, their tales are the silent undercurrent of the medieval past, a reminder of the brutality of a system that used the female body as both the instrument and the victim of its twisted sense of justice. But in the silence of their absence, the echoes of their suffering still linger. And as the world moves forward, their stories must not be forgotten, because in remembering them, we confront the darkness that once consumed them.